Rand Paul has been one of Trump's allies in Congress, in the House of Representatives, in the Senate. And what's wild about this is Rand Paul basically was carrying water for Donald Trump on this notion of the election scam, Donald Trump's attempted coup in broad daylight. Well, Trump, after the march or the raid on the Capitol, basically with all of these people sending death threats to Cori Bush, Warnock, even Mike Pence, because Mike Pence wouldn't necessarily do what Donald Trump wanted him to do, and frankly, didn't even have the power to do per se. Yes, he could have attempted it, but whether he had those powers or not so much. And it's a moot point either way, because Mike Pence basically said, I'm not doing it. Well, Pence also had to take cover because Pence was also under attack in that raid, and Pence was pissed. You've had several Republicans that basically backed Donald Trump up in this nonsense about the Cubans and the communists and all of these people basically working with Kemp in order to screw Trump over. Bad faith. If you don't have anything to show for this, if you can't show anything for this, if you get your stuff thrown out of courtroom after courtroom after courtroom, then what are you using to make this argument that you won in a landslide when you lost? Even if you say, I won by one vote, how do you get the landslide aspect of this? I hope you understand what I'm getting at. It's BS. But Paul carried water for Trump on this. And now Trump is out of it after the Capitol raid, basically jumping the shark. And many of the Republicans are left holding the bag for their guy. Donald Trump put a knife in his supporters. Donald Trump was basically embarrassed and humiliated after the Wall Street Journal article told him to get lost, and bowed his head, walked away. Paul, still there. Paul is getting asked questions that he don't want to be asked and he don't want to answer. And George Stephanopoulos refuses to go into this false neutrality nonsense. What I mean by false neutrality, it's like if, not everything has two legitimate sides. But on media, what you used to have is a Republican and a Democrat, and just because they were arguing, it was as if there were two legitimate sides, where the people for each of their tribes can basically appropriate those arguments, whether or not the arguments are legit or have holes in it or not. The holes in it matters less. The fact that people are seeing you argue is the thing that matters. It communicates to the tribe talking points. Under normal circumstances, when they do this back and forth, the announcer would take this aspect of neutrality, not objectivity, neutrality. Now, I've argued that objectivity doesn't necessarily exist, and neutrality is even worse because not everything has two different positions. One person is arguing that rape is bad and shouldn't happen, and the other person is saying rapists are misunderstood. Should the announcer, in this case, be neutral? I hope you get my point. What does it look like to be neutral during slavery, where you're just standing there as the slave is getting beat and everything else, and the slave master is making his argument about why this process is great, human rights, and the other person saying, no, I don't think it's great. And assume for the moment you're here in 2021, and those are the conversations you're having. I'm trying to make the point that there are not always multiple legitimate sides of a particular argument. And while you could argue rape is great, that's not necessarily something we hold true in our society. They're not always two sides. The flat earther arguing with the person that says the earth is not flat is a ridiculous argument. And it shouldn't be platformed because of how ridiculous the argument is. There aren't always two legitimate sides of an argument. And while people could say whatever they want, I don't believe in the censorship stuff. Let's stop pretending that there always are multiple sides. Rand Paul wants Stephanopoulos to basically do the neutrality nonsense. And understand that neutrality basically is unfair to the side that's aggrieved. Meaning, if you have two sides, one side is bothered, is undermined, is somehow subverted. Maybe the rights of that particular party are corralled by this other side. Neutrality basically allows the aggrieved party to stay the aggrieved party without any full-throated understanding and recognition of the problems associated with that particular situation. It allows the person who's the dominant part to basically make a case on this kind of same level without the person who's in the middle of that, the journalist, being able to determine truth and context. I hope you understand what I mean. Neutrality is not what you look for. Neutrality is horrendous. What you're looking for is the person to be honest in regards to the way they understand it, and they can make their points from that particular point of view. Even objectivity is problematic because, honestly, I don't necessarily think it's all that true. I don't think it's all that real. Each person puts their stake in the ground somewhere, and wherever they put that stake in the ground, that's somewhat where they are. The questions that they ask, the interrogation that they ask, the things that they care about are going to be governed on some level by their environment and whatever their particular ideology is. When you don the persona of a newsman, extending what it means to be human, this kind of object and building a parent class of sorts, that person is still a person. Meaning the ideology of the individual is still there, and telling people that their objective, to some degree, lies. It's some degree a political thing of trying to make it look as if this perspective that is quote-unquote objective is the normal and the right perspective to take. As if there's some vantage point that's entirely perfect. It's nonsense. Neutrality is not what you're looking for. Honest interrogation, an honest ability to admit when you're wrong. Those are the things that you look for. A point of view that is made, and a point of view that is made in earnest. I don't believe for a moment that this argument by Trump was made in good faith. I think all of it was made in bad faith. I think many of the other Republicans looked at it as their gravy ticket to either take power or believe that there will be no situation where they could take power, meaning they could be full-throated because they know that nothing is ever going to take place on the other side that lets them get through. Either way, they fed into this, they backed Trump up with this, and now they have to pay the consequences for it. Welcome to Rand Paul. Flip it out. When George Stephanopoulos doesn't allow the neutrality item and basically goes into Rand Paul and picks him apart, Paul doesn't like it, and Paul loses his shit big time. Welcome to the soapbox. My name is Jamarl Thomas. This is the Progressive Soapbox. Guys, if you dig this content, please like, share, and subscribe. You can always support this content through PayPal or Patreon. This content is brought to you by you, and I appreciate you the opportunity for allowing me to do it. This video is pretty wild. Rand Paul is basically angry that Stephanopoulos doesn't allow him to bullshit on his airwaves. That Stephanopoulos is not using the false trick or the false nonsense of neutrality. It's like the rapist and the guy who says rape is not okay. All right, argue, fight. And the guy just standing back as if these are two legitimate positions. Like I said, not everything has multiple legitimate positions, especially if you have a guideline within the context of your country on things like civil rights and women's rights and human rights. Not everything is a legitimate side. Let's hear Rand Paul. I don't have an issue with the president challenging the election results. That's not really the point here. Donald Trump has lied 30,000 times or more by record. I suspect that number is higher than that. A man that lies that flagrantly, why do you all of a sudden believe he's telling the truth on this? And that's kind of the issue. Do all of these people believe that Donald Trump is being honest? Or are they lumping in because that's an ally, or they believe they're going to get some level of political advantage from people who backed Trump? I think it's that. I don't believe that they believe that Donald Trump actually won this in a landslide. I don't believe that Rand Paul believes that the Cubans were working with Kemp with the blessing of Chinese and the ghost of Hugo Chavez. I don't think Rand Paul believes that. And yet, here Rand Paul is, still pushing the Trump, the lie of the century.
There's the role.
Senator Paul, I have
make a difference, and those things
I have to stop you there.
Where's the role?
Senator Paul, I have
make a difference, and those things
I have to stop you there. No election is perfect, but there were 86 challenges filed by President Trump and his allies in court. All were dismissed. Every state certified the results after investigations, counts, and recounts. The Department of Justice, led by William Barr, said there's no widespread evidence of fraud. Can't you just say the words, this election was not stolen?
What I would suggest is that if we want greater confidence in our elections, and 75% of Republicans agree with me, is that we do need to look at election integrity, and we do need to see if we can restore confidence in the elections.
Now, what right-wingers have basically landed on is election integrity. Now, I am for election integrity. Of course, everybody's for election integrity, which is the reason they're landing on election integrity. If you're having a conversation about beating your wife, whether you did it or didn't do it, it's not necessarily the best light and the best conversation you want to be engaged in. It is far easier to have a conversation about we need to have more integrity in our elections and it needs to be more transparent. That's an easier argument than dealing with the idea that you are basically working with the president for a putsch attempt in broad daylight, and Trump was working with that stuff behind the scenes. So the point is, in a political sense, the face that he'd rather show is not insurrection, but voter integrity. I hope you understand the switch here. Now, Stephanopoulos is not going to allow him to do this, but this is basically what he's trying to do. He's trying to get away from that very specific conversation, and he's trying to use something that most people will agree on, voter integrity, as a way to do it. Shouldn't allow him to deviate and to move from this point like this, even though he doesn't want to have this particular conversation. Let's keep going.
Well, 75% of Republicans agree with.
And by the way, the reason that all of those Republicans agree with Donald Trump is because Donald Trump basically lied for like a month, telling them that they were being cheated and that there was something wrong with the electoral system from the standpoint of the Dominion voting machines and the Cubans and the communists and whatnot. They were telling them that. They were feeding them that. So for Rand Paul to say, well, hey, people are unsure about our electoral system. Yes, I am also unsure about the electoral system. I also want transparency. I do not believe for a minute, however, that a man that has lied like 33,000 times all of a sudden has started to tell the truth. I don't buy it. Don't buy it at all. Yes, we should focus on transparency in our elections. No, that doesn't mean Donald Trump won an election in a landslide when he has nothing to show for it.
With you because they were fed a big lie by President Trump and his supporters who say the election was stolen. Why can't you say?
Well, I think where you make, I think where you make a mistake. Hey, George, where you make a mistake is that people coming from the liberal side like you immediately say everything's a lie instead of saying there are two sides to everything. Historically, what would happen is if I said that I thought there was fraud, you would interview someone else who said there wasn't. But now you insert yourself in the middle and say the absolute fact is that everything I'm saying is a lie.
Isn't that amazing? He basically articulates neutrality. This is his point is, look, when you guys used to bring me on, you didn't push me like this. You just allowed neutrality. You would just stand there in the middle of the argument. As one person talked about getting rid of healthcare entirely, and the other person talking about, hey, maybe people should have a basic level of healthcare. Fight. And you just stand there and watch. That's what you're supposed to do, George. Think about how ridiculous that is. It's like, for him to make the point that basically you're supposed to be neutral to me, regardless of what I say. And you're supposed to have somebody else on that basically just takes the opposing point of view and just let us have our little cockfight with you not adding anything into it, meaning from the standpoint of context, from the standpoint of what's real, honesty, reality, none of that stuff. Stay out of it. That's astonishing. Yeah, they're not always two sides of an argument. That in and of itself is ludicrous. Like I said, the rape thing. Nobody wants to get into this thing of arguing about the efficacy and the awesomeness of rape, or for that matter of slavery, or for that matter, child labor. I mean, there's all sorts of things where people don't necessarily, at least based on our societal framework and what we consider to be ethically and morally, not everything is two sides, just as a point of fact. Also, like I said before, neutrality is grossly unfair to anybody that's aggrieved in a particular argument. If the reality of things is that this person is a maniac, that this person is a killer, or this person is an abuser, or this person is a robber, and you're engaging it as if you're going to be neutral to that person who's doing those things, while simultaneously the person is being robbed, maimed, killed, you're also being neutral to that person. That guy's aggrieved by that person. And yet your neutrality hides that very specific point without adding context and without giving some level of clarity. Rand Paul's problem here is that George Stephanopoulos is basically raking him over the coals for following Donald Trump's lie off of a cliff. And now he's stuck here holding the bag, trying to get away from the conversation. Yeah, he should be raked over the coals for this. And right here, he still can't own up to the fact that the election was stolen. Let's hear this.
This election was not stolen. Do you accept that fact?
Well, what I would say is that the debate over whether or not there was fraud should occur. We never had any presentation in court where we actually looked at the evidence. Most of the cases were thrown out for lack of standing, which is a procedural way of not actually hearing the question. There were several states in which the law was changed by the Secretary of State and not the state legislature. To me, those are clearly unconstitutional. And I think there's still a chance that those actually do finally work their way up to the Supreme Court.
Senator.
So basically, no. Basically, no. I don't believe Donald Trump won this election. He doesn't want to say it. He doesn't believe Joe Biden won it. That's fascinating. That's utterly and entirely fascinating. Yeah, it's just fascinating. Like he's pissed off that George Stephanopoulos doesn't have a bullshit neutrality case. That's amazing. He's like, George, you're making it hard for me, man. Why did you just put somebody across for me where we can argue and the audience doesn't know what the fuck we're talking about or have any context to figure out who's telling the truth? We need to get back to that, George. No, I don't think we need to get back to that. I think it's more honest for a particular journalist or from a particular person to have a political opinion. There's a person behind that particular facade of quote-unquote objectivity. And that stuff peeks through. If you're going to say you're objective and you're not, then you're being somewhat dishonest to me. In which case, I think the framing of it in and of itself, when a person starts off with this idea that they are somehow the objective standard, is false in and of itself. I'm just making the point here that the question is whether or not there's bad faith on the part of Trump and some of the other Republicans in regards to this electoral race. And if there is indeed bad faith, because Donald Trump said he wasn't going to, concede anyway, even before this particular race, well, I have to think that Rand Paul has enough sense to know that. And many of the other political leaders have enough sense to know that and are basically riding that car off of a cliff for either issues of friendship or political advantage. Yes, they should be held accountable if indeed there was some kind of coordination with these guys behind the scenes, as some people apparently saying there is. And yeah, if there was bad faith in this kind of coup in the open, and honestly, if you read the New York Times, the article the other day, coup behind the scenes, where they were basically trying to decertify the results by changing over the acting Attorney General. So this was a big deal. And I know a lot of people are trying to minimize it and undermine it and all this other stuff. But there was basically a mob that ran into the Capitol with multiple people having death threats. You have zip ties, and Lord knows what would have happened if those guys would have got their hands on any of the political congressmen at that point with a fervor that these guys were in. So, and that's on top of Trump trying to get Pence to do something that, even though he technically probably don't have the power to do, the technicality of him not having the power doesn't matter. Oftentimes, that doesn't matter. The fact that the person is willing to make the argument and do it in and of itself makes it real. None of this stuff is real. All of this stuff is conceptual. So if Pence wants to make the argument that, yeah, I do have the power to throw this out, he could have did that. They would have taken him to court, yes. But understand what would have happened if many of the Republicans just basically agreed. This number of Republicans agreed. Let's say the Georgia Republican agreed throughout votes. What if they went along with that? Would it have worked? And the scary answer is yes. This is why this is such a big deal. People are thinking, oh man, nothing happened, so it's not a big deal. That doesn't necessarily matter. Something did happen. The Capitol was breached. You have various members basically in a safe room with people with COVID. Well, multiple people get COVID, not to mention several people died, not to mention the pipe bombs, the death threat. This was bad. That's all. There should be consequences. Like, share, subscribe.